This podcast contains mentions of child death, suicide, and domestic violence, so listen at your own discretion. Storytelling is such an important part of culture, and whether we know it or not, we tell stories every single day for a million different reasons. Now, there's tons of stories that one can tell, some funny, some happy, some sad, and my personal favorite, some scary. Now, when folks tell scary stories, they have their own set of reasons for why they're being shared. Maybe somebody is telling a scary story to try to explain an experience that just seemed unexplainable in any other way. Or maybe somebody is sharing their scary story to really share some anxieties and fears that they have deep down. And then, of course, there are the people who just share scary stories for fun. But today, I want to look at how one certain type of scary story can express more than a fear or an anxiety, or the want to bring out fear and anxiety in somebody else. A lot of people can relate to being afraid. They can relate to maybe the underdog in the story, or the person who gets scared by the big, unknown monster. But I want to talk about how people might relate to the monster. Specifically the story of the Weeping Woman, a type of story that is found in almost every single culture across the world. Before we dive in, my name is Aubrey. I am a folklorist and a current graduate student at CU Boulder. Welcome to my unofficial first episode to my folklore series. For those of you who came from my TikTok, this is a little different from my usual content. For the most part, I've just been sharing scary stories with you and other sorts of legends. But today I want to go beyond the folklore. I want to answer why we might tell these stories and what they could possibly mean for a community. So, welcome to the first episode of Beyond the Folklore, where we're going to take a look at the Weeping Woman figure and ask the question of how people empathize with the monster. Now, to help us answer this question, I'm going to be bringing in a guest, but first I want to tell one variation of the Weeping Woman story so we all understand what this figure in folklore is. Now, again, the Weeping Woman exists in different ways across the world. Each culture has a certain way they tell her. This is just one popular version of her story. The Weeping Woman story begins with a young woman who comes from a very poor village. Now, because she didn't have any resources to sustain herself, she marries a man of higher status in the village. From there on, she has stability, but it's all dependent on her husband. Now, he's not the best husband, but at least she has her 2 kids. Except one day, her husband doesn't return home, and she realizes he has left her for another woman in town. Refusing to take care of his own kids, the woman is left to take care of them on her own, but she is back at square one. She has no resources to care for herself, let alone 2 small children. After a while of being in this situation, she is overcome with emotions. She is angry at her husband for leaving and panicked at the lack of resources that she has. So she resorts to something drastic. Taking her children to a nearby body of water, she decides to drown them. And after seeing what she had done, she is so overcome with grief that she drowns herself too. Now, because of her crimes, because her children are now dead and she has taken her own life, it is said that she is doomed to walk the shores of the body of water she killed her children in. So many years later, after this horrible act, her ghost is said to still be there, crying for her children, searching for them so she can find them in death and have peace. But people often say, be careful if you hear her or see her, because she might mistake you for her child and bring you to the afterlife with her. Again, the story I just told is one general version. There are many other versions across the world with certain details changed. There's various different ways that she is described, various different actions she took, and various different ways that she is said to have died. In some cases, she's known as La Llorona. In other cases, she's called the Woman in White. And in some, she's simply known as the Weeping or the Wailing Woman. tale is not even only a modern tale, but one that links back to many different mythologies over centuries. Some argue that she is inspired by Aztec deities, some say by Greek sirens and figures, and others say versions of her are inspired by Celtic goddesses of the earth. Either way, a lot of these variations like to position this figure of the Weeping Woman as monstrous. And yeah, there are monstrous aspects to her. In a lot of these tellings, she does murder her children in a state of heightened emotion, and she does end her own life. Two things that our society likes to deem as pretty scary and abhorrent. But is there another way we can look at her? Can we even look at her in a more positive light? Well, this is where I'll introduce our guest, Mel Schellenbarger, to discuss how people have empathized with her lately and how people try to position her not as the monster, but as someone they can relate to. So, Mel, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself and who you are?
All right. I am a master's student. I have a bachelor's in psychology, and I am currently working on my master of science in education in clinical mental health counseling.
Awesome. And what are your kind of interests in these things?
I am a major horror fan, and it is sprinkled all throughout, and a lot of horror demonizes the victim. So that's where my interest lies.
So, would you say you're at least somewhat familiar with the Weeping Woman stories and folklore then?
While I don't know the specifics of every story, obviously, I've seen it sprinkled throughout media that I've consumed, everywhere from Supernatural to La Llorona.
Oh yeah, it really is everywhere, and we'll be talking a little bit more about the media presence later on. But to kick off, I just kind of want to get your take on this type of story. How do you think you would define the woman in this piece of folklore? How would you describe her?
Personally, I usually see this woman as someone who is a victim of some kind, who is then demonized and turned into a monster because of the action she took out of desperation.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. So then you're kind of in the right place because today we're going to talk about how she's presented and how people might connect with her and look at her in a different light. Awesome.
So, if you don't mind starting out with talking about how people connect with her.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways people connect with her. Some people connect with her as single mothers. Some people connect with her as a way to express and to understand loss. Some people connect with her as a way to understand anxiety. Some people connect with her as a person who identifies as queer. Um, but let's take the idea first of how single mothers empathize with her. Again, a lot of these ways we empathize with this figure is based on how she's told. So in the version that I told, it's more of the lens in the way single mothers would tell her story. So think about the fact that she is a poor woman who didn't have the resources she needed until she had a husband. And now this husband has left her, and she's faced with a really hard choice. So it was either she watched her children suffer and starve to death, or take their life and spare them from starvation. A lot of mothers can relate to this. A lot of single mothers know the struggle in being able to provide for themselves and their children, no matter what way they became a single mother. They understand that there are hard positions that they find themselves in. So while this choice was a horrible choice to make, and while the outcome is quite monstrous, people understand. And to tell this story, to hear her story, it might make them feel less alone when they're trying to consider what's best for their child. Because sometimes what's best for your child is not very clear. And also, sometimes what's best for your child is not the choice that's going to make them the happiest at the moment either. So while this is, again, a very extreme case of a mother making a hard choice, others can understand where she's coming from, can understand that panic. They can understand the grief that she's experienced and what she does next. There's a lot that people can connect with there.
I want to go back a little bit to when you were talking about how she reads as a queer character. As a queer person myself, I'm really interested in hearing that perspective.
Yeah. Well, again, as I said, in some cases, people really empathize with her and her actions. So I just want to position this by saying I know what she did was extreme, but a lot of queer people can really see her actions as a strong rejection of heteronormativity, right? She's often told as a poor girl with not many choices, again, like the retelling I said, but but she is forced to be married to a man who will provide for her. In some cases, in some retellings, after taking so much abuse from the man, she kills him and destroys anything associated with him. And in this case, again, like I said, it's extreme, but that includes the children that she had with him, that he made her have with him. So essentially, by doing all of this, she's freeing herself of all ties to heterosexual life that she found herself in, that she found herself stuck in. However, again, killing your children is frowned upon, right? Like that's a not a good thing to do in society. So she is still cursed to roam the earth to perhaps make amends for that monstrous action. Even if she was trying to reject heteronormativity, she still did something bad, but people still can understand where she's coming from. They can empathize with that. They can put themselves in their shoes because they know that feeling. Um, and they understand that perhaps if you tell her story that she is mourning in the afterlife, her ghost is mourning as it walks through the beaches of the bodies of water that she's supposed to be found in. She's not mourning her children, but she's mourning the life she desperately wanted because a lot of us queer folks feel like our life started later when we came out, right? We can all connect with that. Um, and there's these really interesting retellings of her that are very queer coded, especially in Spanish and Central America. These retellings are more often songs, and these songs are quite beautiful and also quite queer. They're full of empathy for her. They talk about how sorrowful she seems, not because she lost her children, but because she's in a life that she doesn't want to be in. And they feel sorrow with her. They don't want this beautiful woman to be feeling so sad, and they can understand the sadness. So perhaps we, as queer people, empathize with her rather than villainize with her because we all can understand the pressures of heteronormative culture and how, as much as we try to reject it, it's still being forced upon us almost every single day in little ways. And for the story of the weeping woman, it's very directly forced upon her. Perhaps, again, we empathize with her rather than villainize her because we've been there. In most cases, hopefully, more mild versions of what she went through, but perhaps that's how we empathize with her. That's how we put ourselves in her shoes because we all understand the need to break out of all of these societal pressures to be who we want to be. So we tell her story. We acknowledge the pain that she must have been in to be driven to such extremes. And we understand that when someone feels trapped in a life that goes against who they are on a fundamental level, we as humans take extreme actions to try and push back against something whenever we're caged. So we position her and we empathize with her because we understand that maybe that's what she was doing when we tell these stories.
So you already started to touch on this, but how many different versions of her are there?
Honestly, it's almost impossible to count. Everybody tells a different version that means something different to them. Uh, most cultures have their own version. Like I said, we focused a lot on Central and Latin America and their tellings, and even some of like North American tellings as well. But there's like a whole genre for her in Europe too, right? And they all have different reasons why they might tell it, especially in Scotland and Ireland. And interestingly enough, Scotland, Ireland, and some parts of England, the way they tell their Weeping Woman story, it's not as monstrous as certain versions of her depict her actions. In some versions, she doesn't murder anybody at all. She is still doomed to an afterlife of trying to inadvertently harm the living. That's kind of what makes a weeping woman story, is that it's a woman who died too young and is now cursed to walk the earth and try to harm people. Otherwise, it would not be in this category that we're talking in right now. But in Irish folklore, they often describe her as not even this ghost or spirit, but actually a fairy. And their rendition of her and the way people connect with her is super interesting. So she is known as the Lady of Wynn in some parts of Ireland. It's, again, just one version of her in Ireland. There's others. But it tells the story of a young girl who accidentally caused a flood. And when she caused this flood, she accidentally drowned herself too, along with other people's property and some other people, and unfortunately, a fairy circle as well. And if you know Irish folklore, you do not mess with fairy circles or fairies in general. So, because of this damage, because of this accident, the fairies turned her into one of them, but not quite. She was both sort of a human and sort of a fairy, doomed to be alone in the area that she had flooded. And now people say that she is there trying to find somebody to connect with because she's lonely. Uh, she's also has appeared in other parts of that area. And usually people say, well, when that happens, it's to signify that a misdeed is bound to happen or something not so good is going to happen. But perhaps it's somewhat easier for these people to tell her story because it's a little easier to empathize with this version of her. I'd like to position as we're all human and accidents happen, right? So maybe we tell the story and we don't tell her as a monster, but as this figure that we can understand its loneliness. Because unfortunately, when we have accidents, they can lead to serious harm towards others. We've all done something by mistake and have not meant to hurt somebody, and it just happens. So people might tell her story to relate to that experience, to the experience of accidentally hurting a loved one or accidentally hurting just innocent people without having any intentions of doing this. They might connect with the Lady of Wynn because they understand the guilt and the loneliness that comes with accidental harm and the loss that follows. And even with these like European versions, you can tell that she's so different because of some of the ways they described seeing her. The people of Wellow in England who connect with her, their own Weeping Woman story describes her much more like the queer women of Central America do, as a beautiful figure. Some describe her to glow like dewdrops when they see her. Women and children would know she was near because they heard the sound of very beautiful bells playing, right? She would be found caring for children at night that were either ill or couldn't sleep because their parents were just too tired to lull them back to sleep. But even then, others in that same community, there's kind of like a double edged sword here. For those who describe her as beautiful, others describe her as monstrous. The same woman in white of Wellow. They describe her as a banshee who's out to steal children. So why are there two different views of her, and how do people still empathize with one version where other people are calling her a banshee in another version from the same community? It might be because we all know what it's like to be tired. We all know that sometimes mothers who, or not just mothers, parents who lost their children crave the care that they want to give to somebody. So maybe we see her as this beautiful figure who's helping other parents. But in other cases, the ones that do describe her as a monster, sometimes instead of being able to side with her, to be able to put themselves in her shoes, they don't quite understand it and they just express that fear that perhaps they will lose a child to limited resources, to exhaustion, or to illness. It just really depends on what a person's going through in their life if they're able to actually empathize and to look beyond if something is just a monster.
So I know I touched on this in my intro, but I am a huge fan of scary movies and all things horror. So what media depictions do you find significant?
Well, there's quite a few. The big three are La Llorona, which is a 2019 movie with Linda Cardellini. It's the Central American version of her. Then there's Guillermo del Toro's Mama, which is more so the Americanized version of her. And then we also have The Haunting of Bly Manor, which is like the general European version of her. It's a blend of English, German, Scottish versions of the Weeping Woman. And then we also have some media that includes songs of her, like Disney's Coco has the La Llorona song that I had kind of mentioned previously. And we also have other like big artists singing songs about this Weeping Woman figure in folklore.
It's interesting that you mentioned The Haunting of Bly Manor because that's actually one of my favorite TV shows and honestly anything by Mike Flanagan. But you mentioned such different versions of her story that are portrayed in media. Do any of them actually do her justice?
Well, not all of them, right? So the Spanish songs that are out there definitely show a less monstrous side of her. Like I said, they talk about how beautiful she is, how much they want to connect with her. Um, but for the movies and shows, that's kind of a different story entirely. Out of the two movies, Mama and the show, out of the two movies and the show, Mama does the best job. It's a piece of media that begins to touch more on motherhood than on this monster being a monster. It's at the end, it's not really that she's a monster. She's just a mother desperate to be with her kids, and it kind of paints this picture of different ways people deal with motherhood, right? And what different mothers do when they're faced with turmoil and how they feel they need to protect their kid. So if you're looking for a good piece of media that does her the most justice, that does this weeping woman figure the most justice, then Guillermo del Toro's Mama is the best one out there. The La Llorona movie is probably not the best if you want to go with an in-depth story about this weeping woman that shows other sides to her, right? Because this story kind of reduced her down to like the stereotypical Hollywood monster. Motherhood's a big theme in that too, but not on the side of the weeping woman. Really, they just show the weeping woman as somebody who murdered her kids. They don't give her any backstory, any reason for why she did what she did, really. Like there's a brief mention, but there's no there's not a lot of detail. And it just focuses on her actions and not on this figure in folklore as anything more than the crime she committed before her death. And then for Haunting of Bly Manor, it's a decent retelling. There's more outside of the folklore that it uses that people connect with than the folklore it utilizes for its storytelling. But yeah, like I said, I would absolutely recommend Guillermo del Toro's Mama if you're gonna go with a weeping woman story that does her some justice.
So it seems like there's usually a big dichotomy between either someone trying to give her these round character features, and then people who are only portraying her as a monster and nothing more.
Yeah, but that's not something new to media. A lot of retellings have these more in-depth stories that give her some purpose for her actions, some reason for why she did what she did in life and why she does what she does in her afterlife. But then there are other stories, and honestly, a lot of these retellings on this other side of things are told by men, where they just say she is nothing more than a siren and a seductress trying to lure children and men to their death. It's a hot take, and it really doesn't. These retellings don't like to focus on maybe why she got where she got to right before she died. It just likes to put a lot of blame on women and saying, no, she's just the monster. We can't we can't empathize with her actions. We can't put ourselves in her shoes. But I think after our talk today, hopefully you feel a little differently about that, knowing that there are so many different versions with way more details than she killed her kids and then she killed herself and now she's trying to kill you. There's so much more depth to it than that.
I wasn't actually aware that there were so many more positive retellings of her, especially the one you mentioned about, I think it was the people of Wellow. It's so interesting that one society can have such dichotomous views.
Yeah, but I mean, that just kind of goes into the folklore of everything, right? Every culture has some different things that they like to express, that they feel important. Um, and that kind of influences the various versions we have of the Weeping Woman and what that might mean to a community as a whole and what that might mean to just certain individuals. So, Mel, I have a question for you. After everything that we just talked about, has any of this changed the way you view the Weeping Woman in folklore?
Honestly, no. If anything, it solidified my original opinion that so much of what we know of this lore is from a perspective that paints her as a villain and refuses to take in any outside information or perspective. And yeah, it just solidified everything that I had before.
Yeah, I think it's kind of easy to forget that we tell her story as more than just a villain because when Hollywood kind of boils down stories to tell a clear, easy to understand story, you have the villain and the hero, and usually something that's a ghost is the villain. But in real life, when we tell these Weeping Women stories, we're human and we want to connect with things. And sometimes we connect with the thing that other people might say is scary, right? Okay. Well, thank you for being a guest on my podcast on my very first unofficial episode of Beyond the Folklore. And for those who are listening, I want to leave you all with one last question. Think back to the first story that I told you at the beginning of this podcast. We often label people negatively when they make choices we wouldn't make, especially in times of crisis. So I want to ask, if someone were to tell a story about your worst moments, how would you want to be remembered? This has been Beyond the Folklore. Again, my name is Aubrey, and thank you so much for listening. If you want to hear a few more scary stories, go follow my TikTok, FolkloreFacts. And if you want to dive a little deeper into what legends mean, then stay tuned for future episodes.